Thanks for joining. My name is Jason Volpe. I'm a specialized solutions architect at Amazon Web Services. And today we're going to look at migrating some of your SQL workloads from your on-premise environment and moving them into the cloud, and give you a better understanding of how that impacts your SQL licensing today and moving forward. So let's get into it. Let's take a look at what this looks like. To license SQL on a virtual host, you're going to license the physical cores on that environment. And so what you see represented here are a number of VMs that are running on top of this virtual host. The virtual host has 48 physical cores, and that is what we're licensing to get unlimited virtualization for SQL Server. So we don't necessarily have to worry about the additions of each of the SQL VMs. When you license the virtual host, you always use Enterprise Edition. And when you're on-premise, in order to get unlimited virtualization, you do have to have active software assurance. Now, one thing to note on here is that when you license by virtual host, in this scenario here, the individual VMs are not tied to a certain license. You can have as many VMs underneath that host as you want, and it doesn't change your licensing. But as soon as you move a VM outside of this host, unless it's moving to another host that's also licensed, you'd have to license that VM separately. So just be mindful of that when you move VMs outside of a host that's licensed, it will require additional licensing in most cases. So if you're moving from, say on-premise into the cloud, one of your options that we're going to cover here is to actually move all the host VMs. But again, we'll talk through that in a minute. This is really the only model that gives you unlimited virtualization. So for SQL Server, if you do license the host physical cores, it does allow you to run an unlimited number of VMs. So in this scenario here, because hyperthreading is enabled, it gives you access to 96 virtual cores. So the 12 VMs that you see on here are leveraging 96 virtual cores or threads. And that's important, which we're going to cover in another slide. But also, we did touch on software assurance, and this is really key for on-premise. It's required for unlimited virtualization. It's also required if you use vSphere, DRS, things of that nature that move the VMs. But also, another key aspect is in SQL 2014 and greater, passive rights for SQL Server, which were always, you have one paid license, you get one free passive license. That changed with SQL 2014 and newer, to where that moved from a volume license benefit to a software assurance benefit. So if you need passive use rights, so if any of these have failover to somewhere else, you will need software assurance to continue using that. So just be careful with that about not having software assurance on SQL and needing passive use rights. So let's build this out a little bit. So in this scenario here, we have 3 ESX hosts, and these could be whatever hypervisor vendor you're using. We're just showing VMware as an example here. But this is a pretty common scenario where you have 3 hosts. You're licensing the physical cores on the host, so 48 cores apiece, which totals 144 enterprise cores. So by using 144 enterprise SQL Server cores with software assurance, I have unlimited virtualization within these 3 hosts. And this is a really big, important part of the challenge that many customers are running into when they try and take this architecture and start introducing the public cloud. And that's what we're going to talk about next. So let's move on to the next slide here. So in this scenario here, we're going to cover the implications of moving SQL from host-based licensing on-premise to VM-based licensing. And this is what happens when you start moving VMs one by one off of a host that's licensed at the host level for SQL Server. So if we take a look at these VMs here, you'll notice that there's green and blue, and this represents Standard Edition versus Enterprise Edition. And a minute ago I mentioned that it really doesn't matter what edition you're running, and that's true when you're licensing by host. But as soon as you move a VM outside of its licensed host, you now have to pay attention to what edition it is and how many threads or virtual cores are allocated to it. So on the left-hand side, you'll see all the enterprise VMs that are green. On the right-hand side, you're going to see all the standard VMs that are blue. Underneath each standard VM, you're going to see orange text that says 4-core minimum. So with SQL Server, there is a minimum of 4 cores for every VM. And this is true whether you're running VMs on-premise or whether you're running VMs in the cloud. The difference, though, is that when you're licensing by hosts, like we were just showing on the previous slide, that's where it really doesn't matter how many cores you're allocating because you're licensing the physical hardware. Now we're going through an example here of, okay, I want to take a look at public cloud. I want to move some SQL workloads into the cloud. And by doing that, I'm now moving some of my SQL workloads from a host-based licensing model to individual VMs that are now running in a public cloud. And that's where everything changes. So you could see here, you have 5 VMs here that are green, which are enterprise, and that's taking up, 62 cores. Virtual cores, but you're still having to license the virtual cores when you're licensing by VM. So you could see here that all the small VMs that are running standard edition that are like 1 core and 2 core, they're hitting that minimum of 4 cores. So now on top of the 62 cores that you would need to use if you're licensing by VM, you'd also have to do 28 cores for the standard edition. So you could see how going from host-based licensing when you have unlimited virtualization to VM-based licensing, what the impact is. The other thing to keep in mind is, I know that Microsoft is offering hybrid use benefits. So this is where you're allowed to leverage licenses on-prem and run the same number of cores in the cloud and just pay the consumption cost. Now you can do that, but just keep in mind that the hybrid use benefits are based on what you're currently licensing. So on-prem, you're licensing those 48 cores. You're going to need almost double that to license these VMs individually. So even though you're able to run the 48 cores in Azure, you're still going to need a whole bunch of other cores in order to license the other VMs that are not covered by the 48 that you would get by being able to run the same number of cores on-prem and in the cloud. So just be mindful of that. That has a huge impact. The other thing is when you start licensing by VM rather than host-based licensing, the hyperthreading really does impact your cloud economics. So just be aware of that when you go at the VM level, you're having to pay for cores that you may not be using, and that's one of the benefits of host-based licensing. The other thing is you are penalized for those smaller VMs. So if you have VMs, that are tiny like that, you may want to consider consolidating, say, 2 of the 2 cores into 1 4-core, and that'll eliminate having to essentially pay for 8 cores for 2 VMs when you only need 4. So that's one thing that you want to look at, is right-sizing some of your VMs as you're moving them. And then the other piece is when you license by VM, you absolutely have to have software assurance, and that's because the tenancy model in the cloud, when you're doing individual VMs, is shared. The hardware, you don't control the hardware that's underneath. So it does require software assurance for SQL Server specifically because of the mobility rights that are required. So let's take a look at another scenario here of how do we address this. So the way we address this is by leveraging AWS dedicated hosts. And these ensure that the hardware we're giving you is truly dedicated to your company and therefore isn't a shared tenancy. So in this example, we're using an R5, which matches the size of your existing virtual host. So now if we want to migrate these VMs from your data center to AWS, you'd leverage the VM import-export service, as you can see here. And that essentially takes the VMs and we move them to AWS, but when they finally land on your dedicated host, they'll be running as SQL instances rather than individual VMs. And really the best way to look at this would be if you moved your VMs from a virtual host to a physical server. Really, dedicated hosts are the same scenario really as a physical server. And so you're essentially going to be stacking SQL instances. So if you're moving 12 VMs to a dedicated host, you're going to have 12 instances on that dedicated host. So just be aware of that. And since we're leveraging dedicated hosts in AWS, your licensing model is going to stay the same for SQL. So that's great, because you're not going to be forced to move to VM-based licensing, as you saw on the previous slide. Now keep in mind that Windows Server is going to require data center in this scenario. So if that wasn't clear prior, I just want to make sure that I do call that out. Something else to be aware of is that you're not required to have software assurance if you're running dedicated hosts in AWS for SQL Server. The thing to keep in mind, though, is if you need failover for SQL 2014 or newer, you don't have passive failover rights without software assurance now. So if you do need that capability, then you'll want to make sure that you have software assurance. But if you're just going to be landing these on a dedicated host and they're going to stay here and you don't need that capability, then you're absolutely able to run just license only with SQL, and you can bring those licenses over. Now you already have software assurance on your on-prem host or your on-premises host, because that requires software assurance to get the unlimited virtualization right on-premise. But when you move into the cloud, it is different, and again, you're not required to have software assurance. The last piece to this is always be sure to check the site that you see below for the actual number of instances that you can have on a dedicated host. There's a lot of different options as far as how big, how small, the different types of configuration. You just want to make sure that, if you're moving 12 VMs, you know that it's going to create 12 instances. You just want to make sure that the host you pick can support 12 instances. Now that's a small number, so it's probably not the best example, but if you're moving, 40 hosts, different story, or 40 VMs, that's going to create 40 instances. So, you just want to make sure that you pick the right host. But again, there's a plethora of options that you have. Lastly, I just want to give you a couple resources. The Windows FAQ, that first one, Microsoft and AWS, is a great site. If you have any questions as far as what you can run Microsoft-wise on AWS, the licenses that you can leverage, the different use cases that you have rights to, it's a great resource. The other piece is what I was just referring to, that dedicated host configuration. You'll want to check that when you're picking what kind of dedicated host, the size that you want to land these VMs on when you migrate. And then lastly, if you have specific questions as far as, I have this Microsoft workload, I want to run it in AWS, you can email us at microsoft@amazon.com, or you can also email me directly, and that's my email right there. With that, I want to thank you for your time. I hope you learned a lot and look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.